The previous two sessions on Philemon were about what we know from the biblical letter to Philemon and what we don't know. We've read the plain text and we've tried to read between those lines. In this session, I'm going to go beyond the biblical account and look at some long-standing traditions of the church. One quick return to the biblical text, though. Towards the close of Paul's letter to the Colossians, Paul tells the Christians in Colossae that he is sending one of his assistants to them, Tychicus. Paul didn't mail his letters with UPX or FedEx. He had them delivered by his co-workers. Tychicus is one such co-worker. But the Colossians text says that one other person was accompanying Tychicus on the mission to Colossae. Who? Well, Onesimus. Was it the same Onesimus? As I said earlier, it was a common name, but given that we already know of one Onesimus that is known to Paul and the church in Colossae, it would be strange for Paul to reference a different Onesimus without giving some context clues to let them know that he was talking about some other random dude with the same name. It sounds like the same Onesimus. And now he is not a slave in the house of Philemon, but he has joined Paul's cohort of evangelists and church planters. Again, we're really reading between the lines here, but I don't think we're reading anything into the text that isn't already there. Around the year 110, Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, writes a letter to the church in Ephesus. Of course, this is not a letter that made its way into the Bible, but it is regarded by scholars as a legitimate work of a legitimate early church bishop. At the very beginning of Ignatius's letter to the Ephesian Christians, he says, "I received, therefore, your whole multitude in the name of God, through Onesimus, a man of inexpressible love, and your bishop in the flesh, whom I pray you by Jesus Christ to love, and that you would all seek to be like him, and blessed be he who has granted unto you, being worthy, to obtain such an excellent bishop." Again, the question, is it the same Onesimus? And again, the answer, who knows? But it's possible. If Onesimus was a young guy during the whole issue with Philemon affair, then it's possible that as an old man, he was still around and a prominent Christian leader. If it's the same Onesimus, then in the early 2nd century, he would have been one of the last remaining people who had a direct and personal connection with the Apostle Paul. His resume would have included being called a spiritual child and brother with Paul. Paul would have written a letter to him that not only vouched for him, but which vouched for his faith. And if it's the same Onesimus from Colossians, then not only did Paul vouch for him, but he became a co-worker with Paul. Would this have been enough for a man to become a prominent leader in the post-apostolic age and take the mantle as bishop or overseer of the church in Ephesus? You better believe it would. The Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, has a long-standing tradition that Onesimus was indeed bishop of Ephesus. In fact, the Eastern Church also says that Philemon was bishop of the church of Colossae, which would make total sense if indeed the church of Colossae met in his home, as we see in the early verses of the letter to Philemon. It is said that when Bishop Ignatius, remember him, was captured and transferred to Rome to be executed, that Bishop Onesimus traveled to Rome to minister to him. One tradition says that Onesimus was martyred during the persecutions under Nero, and another said that he was martyred under Emperor Trajan. Either way, he is said to have been imprisoned and tortured, and yet was unwavering in his faith in Jesus, and thus he was stoned to death. One last little echo of tradition from the ancient church. It is said by some that Onesimus, who owed not only his Christian faith to Paul, but also his very life, had such a devotion to Paul that he wasn't satisfied with being his co-worker and friend, but that Onesimus took it upon himself to procure and preserve the writings of the man who saved him. How else would we have this little scrap of a letter, 25 verses and 335 words, a letter from one man to another about a slave? Who would save such a thing if it wasn't the man who owed his life to that letter? This little tradition says that the reason that we have Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, Galatians, and Philemon in our Bibles is because this slave-turned-Christian leader took it upon himself to locate them, compile them, and preserve them. So this slave, largely forgotten by the Christian church in the West, may have had an incredible impact on the Christian faith of today. Can you imagine not having Paul's letter to the Romans? Can you imagine not having 1 Corinthians 13 to read at every wedding? Can you imagine grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ not being a part of our lexicon? If these traditions have any truth to them at all, they tell the story of a slave who was able to not only be seen as human and as a fellow Christian by the Apostle Paul, but who was also welcomed into the highest rungs of leadership in early Christianity. What was the place of a slave in the ancient church? Apparently, the sky was the limit.